is Winston Parker. I joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940 and started my training in Canada. I trained here for quite a few months, and I went overseas and arrived in England late May. My service number was 60366, and I trained at Cranwell in England for my wireless. Then I went to Pershore up near Coventry for my O2U, and then went to 101 Squadron RAF at Oakington. When the Canadians started to form their own squadrons, 419 was the first Canadian bomber squadron. Moose Fulton was the commanding officer, who had quite a name for himself, and Jimmy Payton and myself, both wireless air gunners, were transferred to Mildenhall.
And what date was that?
I can't tell you the date it was, but right after the Scharnhorst and Eisenhower and the Prince Eugen went up the channel. They sneaked up the channel and beat the British pretty bad and got away with it. And my pilot got killed on that raid, but Jimmy Payton and I weren't in the crew that day. And so that's why we got transferred to a Canadian squadron.
So the day you were shot down, where were you off to?
On April the 8th, we were detailed on the battle order to go to Hamburg on a bombing raid. Before we got to Hamburg, we got set on fire, and we were having lots of trouble. So we tried to get back to England, but there wasn't to be. We'd thrown away our guns and everything and tried to fly on one motor, but we had to bail out at near Oldenburg, which is right close to Holland. It's the last German area before you get to Holland. And that was April 9th. Midnight had gone by by the time we were shot down. I hid out and got away for a few hours, but I got picked up by what was their home guard. I was hiding in a shed out in the field. I thought I might be able to make it, but they found me. And we got sent, the whole crew was gathered up except the rear gunner, and somehow he got hung up bailing out, went down with the aircraft, and it blew up before it hit the ground. The rest of us went to Stalag VIIIB and the old interrogation station. And from there, our pilot was an officer, and he went to Stalag VIIIB, and the rest of us were NCOs, and Jimmy and I being the only two Canadians. It wasn't very many days after we'd finished with Stalag VIIIB before they loaded us in train cars. They weren't cattle cars, they had seats in for about 9 people, but they put 16 of us in. No, it was 4 days, 5 days it took us to get from Stalag VIIIB to Lamsdorf, which was in part of Germany. Since the war, Lamsdorf has become no more because Poland got some of the German land back, and it has a German name, or a Polish name, and I can't tell you the name of what Lamsdorf was changed to. After, when we got to Lamsdorf, or to the VIII-B, we found out there wasn't many airmen there, and they had told us that we will go to an Air Force camp. However, they were shooting down so many aircraft for them that we never got away from VIII-B because there was a shortage for air camps everywhere. The camp that they had, it was 4 billets in the center of this huge camp, which had about 26,000 men attached to it. Before I got there, a couple of airmen had sneaked down to an airport not long away from the camp and stolen a German aircraft, so they were very strict about airmen weren't allowed out of camp. In the compound we were put in, there was 4 buildings. I don't know how long they were, but there was 15A and 15B, 16A and 16B, 17A, 17B, 18A, and 18B. And 2 of them are completely empty, locked up. They would hold, comfortably about 90 people in a section. In the center of the camps, these 2 long buildings, was our washing facilities, which are tubs for washing clothes and a shower. And when we got water, that was all right, but we were very often without water. And the Germans just sometimes turned the water on, we'd all get soaked up, and then they turned the water off, and you're out of luck to get rid of it. For our toilet facilities, we had a half barrel in a little alcove just at the entrance of each building. And one of the first jobs when you arrive in camp is you get detailed to be the Joe boy to look after that. And it was done in turns. It was all fair that way. And I tell you, it's a pretty hard job to do the first time or 2, but you get used to anything.
So how long were you
in? It wasn't too bad when there wasn't too many of us, but then they started to bring in more people and more people. And finally it got so that our half barrels were running over sometime between midnight, 2 or 3 in the morning, and the mess would be terrible. Then, after much agitating, the Germans allowed us to walk to our latrine, which was at the south end of the compound. We called it the 40-holer. There was room for 40 prisoners to relieve themselves, and at each end of the building was a urinal, and underneath was just a big cement tank, and they used to pump these tanks out every so often with sometimes a couple of cows, sometimes a horse and a cow, sometimes 2 horses pulling the wagon, but they used it for fertilizer for fields around the camp and grew turnips with it. And they fed us the turnips.
So how long were you in the camp?
I was in there from then till in 1945. One of the main fixtures at Stalag VIIIB for the airmen was our guard, Ukraine Joe. And Joe Kissel was his name. And Joe was a big, mean guy. He thought nothing of whipping a guy, or I didn't see him shoot anybody, but the fellas had seen him shoot a couple of fellas. And Joe also had a bit of a sense of humor, I guess, because we'd be playing bridge and he'd come and stand behind and watch for a little while and keep his eye on everything that was going on. And some guy'd have a poor hand and he'd say, dry ices, eh? I mean, there's 3 aces. He'd get a kick out of doing something like that. Cigarettes was our bargain money, and Canadians got lots of cigarettes sent them to them at times, and I didn't smoke, but I used to get quite a few cigarettes, so it came in handy for buying some things. And we had some pretty clever chaps there. They made radios and they made blowers to get every inch of heat out of a bit of wood that we'd have to cook our own meals. And as I say, a meal, to heat up whatever we had. And the radios, one compound was set up real good, and they would get the BBC News and never read it in that compound. They would come around and read it in the other compounds, so that we got it. And I don't know if the Germans ever did get that one good shot. They got a few, but another guard in the camp was with the Canadians. When I say the Canadians, the boys that came from Dieppe, they came into our camp, and they had a kind of a rough trip in, and they had a guard issued to them that was a little guy, but he was a miserable little devil, and so they named him Spitfire. And then whenever Spitfire was coming, and he was always nosing into something they were doing, one of the guys would say, "Air raid." That was the note that Spitfire was coming. When those boys came from Dieppe, they went into the compound next to us in the south, and it was, we called it the Russian compound because the Russians were a bunch of Russian prisoners were in there earlier in the war, and then they built their own camp and supplied the labor for it anyway, and moved into a Russian camp. And then the compound they had was used for anybody that came in new, and then they got sorted and put into the different areas that they were supposed to be. And I can remember when they came, well, they had late news for us because we've been several months in the prison camp. And I hadn't had a food parcel yet, or a clothing parcel. I'd grown a big Wild Bill mustache, and all I had on for summer clothes, I was wearing my underwear cut off to make shorts, and we would holler across the double fence to the boys from Dieppe. We were working on getting news, and I said to one of the chaps, when they said the Calgary tanks, some fellas there, I said, "Did you know a fellow by the name of Tommy Pinder?" And they said, "Yeah, he's here." And so Tommy, they went and got message to Tommy, and I stood with the fence, and he walked up and down, and with my long Wild Bill mustache and no clothes on but a pair of shorts, he didn't recognize me. Tommy was one of the ones that later on, he got TB, and he was invalided home in a prisoner exchange for an invalid German prisoner from Canada.
So did you receive mail, and were you able to get stuff from home?
Yes, we got mail, spasmodically. Depends how the Royal Air Force or the Air Force, Canadian Air Force, whatever, the whole bunch together, they made the train pretty uncertain in Germany for lots of times. Mm-hmm. And they did the same with our our Red Cross parcels, and they did with the mail. You didn't know when it was coming in because of the transportation problem. Anyway, we were allowed to write one letter. It was a folded letter thing. They used to sell them at the post office here too for them to send to us.
Yeah.
And 2 cards in a month. So we could send word out to 3 different people in a month. And when you'd use for 3, then you're out of luck till the next month. and we could receive whatever mail came. And sometimes I know fellas would go 3 months, 4 months, and never get a letter. Then they get 8 or 10, and we were all in the same boat.
So would that mean that the Germans had kept them, or they just had taken that long to get through?
No, it just took a long time to come. And one of the things that I was very sorry to have happen, people here didn't realize the low level of living we were at in a prison camp.
Yep.
And Wat May had given me 2 pictures when he flew the first mail to a Klavik from Port McMurray. And when he landed, there was a very high wind and he tipped on the nose. He hadn't done much damage to his plane, but he got a picture of it. And he gave me those pictures and said, hang on to them, someday they might be worth $1. Well, my mom thought I'd like to have them, so she mailed them to me in the prison camp. Well, you know, the result was that I never saw the pictures again.
No.
That part was all blanked out. The pictures were missing, and I didn't get them. But people just didn't realize the low end of life that we were living. They thought we must have bedrooms and places.
Exactly.
Good stuff. Anyway, that was that. I should mention the food at VIII-B. It was anything but good. When we first arrived there, they had a blood soup, and it had barley in it, and we new arrivals, we turned up our nose at that, and different fellas say, can I have yours? And no, we'll never eat that. We'd eat anything a little while later. But anyway, for the most part, one of our staples was potatoes, Kartoffels in German. And you had a couple of fellas detailed as from each compound to go down to the big kitchen where they'd boil the potatoes. And you had a big box with handles running out each end, and 2 fellas could take quite a lot of potatoes that way.
Yeah.
And you take it'd be weighed out or measured out with a shovel to so many persons get so many potatoes. And then when you got back to the compound, we were divided into tables, and there'd be maybe 8 on a table, and there was somebody responsible from your 8 people to make sure that they were there when the spuds came up to get the spuds, and then they were supposed to put them out into equal rations, and then you can come and get your ration of potatoes. And you'd get 1 or 2 half-decent potatoes, and nearly always 1 or 2 that were black, and you picked out what you could eat.
Yeah.
So another thing we got was, we called it fish and sweets, but we got a soup that came up, and it was a turnip soup, and it had some kind of fish. Sometimes fish scales were in it, and it's a terrible stuff. Well, I think a lot of people know that prisoners got pretty handy. We made little blowers, just a little bit of wood with heat something, made a fan and a little blower, and you could put your Dixie over that, which had the soup in it, and get it pretty hot. Or we made frying pans out of old cans that we kept, and the frying pan didn't have to be big because we didn't have very much to put in it. But anyway, we'd strain out the water and then turn this fish and sweets into a pancake and fry it till it was pretty near black on both sides. Then you could eat it. And then we got that, I think it was twice a week most of the time. And then we got different soups. You never knew what you were getting. we got a kind of a cheese they call it a fish cheese, and it was just about like what it sounds like.
I was gonna say, it
It's
doesn't sound
terrible
very
stuff.
good.
And then we would get a Red Cross parcels. And if we were living on German rations in the camp, we were below the sustainability level. It was a starvation diet. But when the Red Cross parcels come in, they were all fortified with vitamins, and you just see the fellas when the Red Cross parcels come in regular for a while. We looked pretty good and we felt pretty good, and it was a godsend to us, the Red Cross.
And how often would you get those?
Well, you're supposed to get a parcel a week, but that was out. But
Didn't happen.
and the Germans, you know, the Persians were trying to hoard a little food so they could make an escape, and they had something to go. So the Germans decided, well, they fixed that. So we go down with our Dixie cup, which is just a saucepan, but it was called your Dixie.
Yeah.
And you go down there, get and it'd pass three to a parcel, or whatever. And you'd go down, and the Germans would puncture a can of jam, and they'd open a can of jam and dump it into your Dixie.
Oh.
Then they'd open a can of sardines, dump it into your Dixie. And so then that's where we got the name Glop from. We ate Glop because it was all good food, but we couldn't keep it. Had to be eaten pretty soon.
Yeah.
And of course we had no fridges or anything like that, just whatever the weather was. And so we had Glop. Well, then there was so much kicking about that, the Germans got so, instead of doing it that way, they punctured every can before we could have it. Well, that way it was much better, at least it wasn't mixed up.
Yeah.
And we got black bread, I don't know, inch and a quarter off of a fairly big black bread loaf, and it wasn't the nicest of bread, but it sustained you. It was far more sustaining than white bread.
Yep.
It was pretty good that way. And sometimes the parcels would go several months without coming in. We'd run out in the camp, and you could see the guys going downhill, and they got cranky.
Yeah, I imagine.
Just the health wasn't so good. Then there'd be a bunch of parcels come in, and we'd revive. We'd all come up and build up for a while. And that was literally because of the Air Force taking out different transportation areas. They were always after transportation, so the trains didn't get through. I might tell you one funny instance. The one Christmas, I don't know, it was 43, 44, we got Red Cross parcels, and they'd worked it so that we could have a parcel at Christmas time each, and that was pretty nice. And one of the things in each one of those was a Christmas pudding. So that was a prized event, and they didn't puncture the cans for Christmas. They let us have our whole parcel. So inside the billets, we had heaters, which we never used except for special occasions because we didn't have fuel. But you could put up the fire in these heaters, and they had a big oven built atop of them, were halfway up, and there was a door you could open and put stuff in above the stove and get whatever you wanted heated. So Christmas was going to be a pretty good do. And we used to take turns and going walking and different things we were doing. So I decided I'd go for a walk, and I said to a chap, one of my friends there, would you put my Christmas pudding in when it comes our table turn? He said, sure. So I went for a walk, and I used to try and keep myself in shape and just walk around the compound. That's all you could do. And when I came back in, boy, the billet smelled good. And the guys were all laughing when I came in. And gone over, Parker, they gone over to my table. And there was my can that the Christmas pudding was in. It had gone off like a bomb. The guy forgot to punch a hole in it.
Oh.
So it got hotter and hotter and hotter, and then it blew. And that was a nice aroma.
Smelling
didn't have any Christmas
smelling
pudding.
your pudding. But you didn't get any pudding. Did he at least share with you?
You have lots of fun like that. The guy made fun. Jimmy Payton, who was the other wireless operator in my crew, and the chap with the name of Dave Moran, he came from just north Edmonton. And he'd been captured, shot down near Sweden. And they got to be good friends, and they made an escape together, and one thing and another. But anyway, this one day we got honey from the Argentine, and we got our black bread. And so when the honey came, it was a can between 4.
Mm-hmm.
So we opened the honey and got the black bread, and Jimmy Payton, of my crew,
Mm-hmm.
he was missing. So we put Jimmy's quarter of honey on his bread and saved it for him. And finally Jimmy came along, but as soon as you open honey anywhere in there, it's the same here. The bees or the wasps and things can find it.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave Moran grabbed poor wasp and he squeezed him a little, and he decorated Jimmy's piece of bread with the honey on it each corner. And then when Jim came in, he just looked at it, acts as if he never saw him. He ate the whole thing. And there was lots of guy made fun like that. Another thing we did, cigarettes would come in,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody could have some cigarettes. Well, then we'd catch a big old blowfly, and we get a little tiny piece of thread,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a little small piece of tissue paper tied at that end. We'd tie the other end to the blowfly's leg,
Mm-hmm.
and then let him loose. And then we'd bet on where he was going to land, which window, which pane. And talk about men and amusing themselves.
Yeah.
Another thing we did one day, I remember we got a bunch of cheese from the Argentine. And when across the equator like that, it's a long trip. And there was lots of maggots in the cheese. So we'd get out 2 or 3 maggots and draw a line, and then draw another line. We put the maggots on the first line, and then you'd bet on your maggots and which one crossed the line to the other. Won the cigarettes. When I was talking down the Deb boys, I should have put this in then. But anyway, when the Dieppe fellows were fighting at Dieppe, the Canadians took some prisoners, and they were going to take them back to England. Well, it turned out there was no going back to England, and some of these chaps that had the prisoners, they didn't want to be fighting against us anymore, so there was a few German soldiers died with the hands tied. And Hitler heard about this, and that was only a couple, 3 days after they'd been in the camp where at VIII-B. A bunch of Germans came into their compound with a bunch of cords. I don't know, they'd be maybe 6 feet long, the cords. They weren't too clean, they were quite rough. And they tied their hands. And that went on from 8 in the morning till prayer time. I think that was 5 at night or 6 at night. They had their hands tied, and we used to tease them a little bit, holler across the fence, "Oh, they'll take them off for Christmas. You'll be all right Christmas Day." Well, it turned out we had a smile on the other side of our face pretty soon, because next thing one day when they came into our compound with a bunch of cords, tied up all the Air Force. And we had to put up with that for 3-4 weeks. And the cords were very miserable. They put them on, you had your hands crossed like this, and they went around both this way and that way, tied them pretty tight. And my experience was that my hands would swell up because, not every day, but when they tied them tight, they would swell up. And the Germans weren't very fast in taking them off. They'd like, sure, you're well swollen before they took them off. They also were pretty strict. We weren't allowed to sit down or lie down, or we had to stay on our feet and wear these damn cords on their wrists. And it was pretty miserable. Then one day, a small truck, about a 1-ton truck, came driving into our compound, lifted the hoist on the box, and out come, I don't know how many pairs, but enough for all the POW Air Force, handcuffs, brand new, made in England. I guess they'd been imported earlier. The handcuffs were fairly heavy handcuffs, had a chain, I don't know how long it would be, 14, 16 inches long, and they clamped on. And anybody like myself who like to get out and try and keep yourself in shape and exercise a bit, on cold days, it was sure cold days, cold metal on your wrist, and you couldn't get a glove above or a coat sleeve below. And they gave me quite a bit of trouble after I got home for a year or two. My hands would swell up when I done certain jobs at the home oil there, when we'd get into warm and cold weather and warm and cold jobs, and I'd finish up, I could only wear mitts because I couldn't get gloves on. My fingers would be so swollen, but it passed away. Anyway, we wore them, and it was pretty strict for a few months, and we learned to pick the locks on our outfits so you could, cold in the morning, you'd have your greatcoat on, and when you got warmed up, the day got nicer on, you'd pick your lock, and you had to do it pretty quietly and pretty secretly, and guys got pretty handy helping each other, doing it pretty fast.
So did you ever get caught taking them off?
I didn't, but lots of guys did.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it finished up, then it got so, instead of being miserable about it, the Germans thought it was a bit of an asinine trick to pull too. And they got so they weren't as strict with us, and we wore the things for pretty near 11 months from the time the court started till the handcuffs were disbanded. Anyway, we made it, and we always called it chained up, but I don't know if all the boys did, but when George Hayes was the Minister of Veterans Affairs, he was a very good guy to us in the government, and he went to bat for us and got us a pension for prisoners of war. And you got, if you were in a prisoner over a year, you got I think it was 5% over 2 years, 10%, I'm not sure just how it went.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, over 3 years, which I was over 3 years, 15% pension. And it just shows what pensions are like when they're indexed. My pension started at, I don't know, under $200 a month. Today it's closer to $2,000 a month. And you can see why politicians like to get on to index pensions. Another thing worth mentioning is Stalag VIIIB had the name of being the reprisal camp, and one time some inspectors came from Geneva from the Red Cross to check out the prison camps, and they came to VIII-B, and in the Air Force we had a chap by the name of Mackenzie, an Australian, who had been nominated to be our spokesman, our camp leader.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And he really went after the Red Cross and told them like it was, and they'd had other reports too. So the Germans said, well, that was fine. They would move us into a new camp, and VIII-B would be finished up. So that was quite satisfactory, sounded good. Except the only thing that happened was they changed the number of VIII-B to 344. We never changed one iota of anything. It's just the same setup. But we finished the whole time. The last of the war, we were in 344, but it was still VIII-B.
Oh.
One of the better things we had in Stalag VIIIB was outside of the camp, a few hundred yards outside, was a lazaret. The lazaret was a small hospital. It was run by prisoner doctors, Australian and New Zealand and British, that had been taken, whether it was Greece or the Middle East or in France, whatever. And they had a fair battery of doctors, and they had lots of medical personnel from the medical units that travels with an army, and we got very good care down there. I got pleurisy one time, quite bad, and when you got told you were going to the lazaret, a couple of your friends they'd give them a stretcher, and your two friends would have a guard, and they would carry you down to the lazaret. And I got put into a billet with a chap that had an army chap, and he'd been in the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
and he had malaria very bad. I felt so sorry for him, the way he really went through the middle with his perspiring, and then he was freezing and so cold. And there was just the two of us in a room. It was summertime, and lots of mosquitoes around at the time. And next thing I knew, I had malaria. And that's going to be the only place I could think of getting malaria, because I hadn't been to the Middle East, and I hadn't been around the places where it spread. So I think a mosquito traded a little blood for him and me and gave me malaria. And that troubled me for quite a few years. I've outgrown it now, but I'm 101 years old. You think of some of the things that happened. They had a chap there, was a patient, and he was a little bit queer. And one day, some gramophone records came into the lazaret, and they were pretty precious things, anything that for entertainment to us. And this guy got two of them, and he got three of them, and he could juggle them. And he'd walk around the room juggling these records, everybody hoping he didn't break one. But anyway, he didn't. They made sure he didn't get hold of them again. Another time was there, and there was a fellow who was having some mental problems, and he decided to end it all, so he slit his throat. And there was a doctor just coming up, he even had clamps on himself, and he clamped the guy's arteries, whatever, and saved the guy's life. But sad to say, later I heard that he did the same trick, and that time it couldn't save him. We used to entertain ourselves sometimes. A little bit risky, but you got fun out of doing it. But one day we got our potato issue, and our second pilot and myself were the two guys on hauling potatoes that day, and we hauled up the potatoes, spread them out, and I said to Mac, he was only 19, he was shot down on his first trip.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, I said to Mac, "You game for trying to have some fun?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Let's go back, pretend we haven't had our potatoes, and see if we can't get a double issue." He said, "I'm game." So we walked down to the big kitchen where they prepared the potatoes, one thing or another. And the guard, an English chap who was working there shoveling the potatoes into the what's called. I winked at him. He knew he'd seen us before. I winked at him, and so he started to shovel potatoes in. And when they got right up, I said to the Englishman, "Quiet, that's good." And we picked them up. The German just looked at us. He was confused, I guess. So we got a double ration that day. We'd have sure been in trouble if we a couple of weeks in solitary confinement. But that happened.
You had to make your fun. You had to make fun.
Yeah. You know, every guy was for his country, and every guy was for the bunch. Yeah, we're in there together. We're all equals, and we just stuck like that. I can remember talking to my friend Dick Thornhill, who marched out with me, and Dick said one day, he was just standing looking at the flags on the front of the camp where you come into the main gates. He said, "I'm just waiting for the day we take that damn swastika down and put the Union Jack up." But anyway, we never saw that day because we got marched out of Germany, out of VIII-B, and finished a long way from it. When we were in VIII-B, the Russians were really hammering the Germans at Stalingrad, and one day they brought in a whole bunch of bread that had been sitting on the railway side for I don't know how long, and it was supposed to go to Stalingrad, but they couldn't get it there. And so we got a big issue of bread each that day, and instead of the real black bread, it was a brown bread, a dark brown bread. And we got a fair slice off of each loaf that they put around, but it had been sitting on the siding for quite long, and every once in a while there was some bad damage, and there was a Cockney English chap there, and they're always good for a joke. He got a fair-sized piece of bread, and then it was either a rat's nest or a mouse nest, likely a mouse nest. But anyway, it wasn't fit to eat it. And he goes up to the German guard and said to the German guard, "Look at my bloody kike." Got a big laugh at it, but that's the kind of things that kept us going, was the humor.
When you say black bread, was it what was in it that made it black?
I don't know.
It was just black?
Yeah, it wasn't really black, but it was very dark.
Very dark?
Yeah. We called it black bread. there was lots of instances like that. We had a chap in the camp, and guys used to dream, you know, you used to hear lots of funny things, a bunch of people in the camp. And at night, at lights out, then there was always some guy had a story to tell, and they'd tell a story and everybody get a laugh. But anyway, we had a Kiwi, Tiny, we called him. He was great big, one of the biggest men in the camp. And this one night, Tiny was on the top bunk. Our bunks were something I didn't mention, but if you get those pictures from them, you'll see what they're like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's easier than trying to describe them. But anyway, the bunks were 4 bunks down below, 4 bunks just above them, and 4 more bunks just above them.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 3 and 3 and 3 and 3. So that gives you 12 bunks to junk. Mm-hmm. Would you believe when the fleas and the mice, the lice and stuff was bad in the camp, we'd get permission from the Germans and we'd go to work and we'd take them all apart and get a fire going and scorch all their boards and put them back together so to try and get some relief. The bed bugs were the worst.
Yeah, I imagine.
But anyway, I was going to tell you about Tiny. He got reliving his trip when he was being shot down, and he bailed out. He bailed out onto the cement floor, banged his head.
Oh, no.
Of course, everybody laughed at him. He didn't get sympathy, but heck of a nice guy he was. Well, that's part of the humor we had at the stage. And I can remember the musical Oklahoma came out.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we got the records for that. And they were pretty precious. So they arranged that they could take the records to a billet and play it when we'd all gone to bed. Then everything's quiet and everybody could hear it. Supposed to be able to hear it anyway. Mm-hmm. And we live it. And I can remember the big chuckle when, what's the name of the actress that was leading to that? But she said, when the guy gets to talking pretty and so on, what you're supposed to do, spit in his eye? I got a big laugh. And in the camp sometimes they had a theater, and some fellas went into the theater, and they put on a show once in a while, and they had school, and you could go to school, but they didn't get patronized as much as they should. The guys are like me. I'm not going to learn that damn German. I should have made a point of learning it.
Yeah.
But
well, they were the enemy.
Yeah. Another afterthought for VIII-B. The Air Force weren't allowed out on working parties. Sometimes they took 3 or 4 of us out with a wagon to get firewood by cleaning up the forest just close to camp. And then they had us guarded, and we could have the wood that we had salvaged to clean up the forest for firewood. But if you wanted to go out on a working party and were genuine about an escape, what you did was you contacted somebody, and there was a good grapevine worked on it. The fellas who were in the know and passed the word around. But anyway, you'd pick out a chap in the army that was about your build, and you'd contact him, and then you studied for a while, because you were going to change identity completely, and you learned the street he lived on, or the farm he lived on, or whatever, his family's names, and you just got all his history. He did the same thing on you. And then one day, an example is Jimmy Payton, who was the other wireless operator in our crew. He wanted to make an escape, so he got the groundwork done, and one day he went sick, and chap quite a little bit heavier build than Jimmy, he wasn't a very big chap, came back, and he was Jimmy Payton still, this new chap. His name was Owen Loney, and he was in the Buffs in a Scotch regiment, and he traded, and he got all the know-how who Jimmy was, and he came from French Canadian family. His dad was Scotch, his mother was French, but they got all the rope on each other, and Jimmy Payton and Dave Moran, they decided to get on the same working party and escape together. And their fill-ins came to the Air Force compound, supposedly still airmen. Well, that worked out all right for quite a little while. And Jimmy and Dave, one night they decided, well, tonight we'll go. It's a pretty decent night. And so they got away from their working party, which weren't too heavily guarded, and stole 2 bicycles, and they were doing great. And they were going up a street the wrong way and got picked up going the wrong way up a one-way street. They came back on bread and water for a while at the camp, and they got out again. Another chap in our crew, a chap by the name of Brooks, he traded with a New Zealander who was quite a bit Maori. And Brooks, the first time he went out, I've forgotten, he wasn't out very long. They picked him up and they brought him back to camp. And he did his time on bread and water. And then this next time he swapped with this Maori chap. And this time he got away and he got into Poland, and they didn't catch up to him, and he joined the Polish underground, and he did a lot of sabotage in Poland throughout the war. And when the Allies had taken over Poland, he was kept back because they needed him so much. He was so important as a liaison officer for the army to use. And he stayed in the Air Force, became a CO of a squadron, and he died a few years ago. But they had his full story in our Legion magazine a few years back. But he got commended for his work there in the war. But that's how you would get to go out on a working party. And some fellows, we just did it to get out for a change, and it's a long, hard way to get out of Germany into Switzerland. I had a New Zealand friend that got to the Swiss border twice, got picked up at the border.
Wow.
Yeah. He and I were in solitary confinement one day and I forgot what I was in for. It wasn't very much. But anyway, he said to me, there's a football game going on down there. He said, let's see if we can't go to it. He was the greatest bluffer. So he calls to the guard. The guard came and he told him, we two are due at the doctor's office in 5 minutes, and you're supposed to have a guard here to take us. Well, the guy never heard anything about it. Well, the boy said, well, you'll be in wrong if you don't. We got to do something about it. He said, you let us go. We'll come back on time. the guy thought that was maybe the easiest way, so he let us out. We went and watched the football game for a few minutes. Then came,
And then came back.
we came back. But that's the kind of a guy he was. And those are the fellas that made the escapes. And
Wow.
one day, it wasn't too bad a day, and we needed some firewood, and we got arranged that 4 of us could go out on push a wagon, just an ordinary farm wagon, push it out into the forest, and load it with branches and stuff that we cleaned up in the forest, and bring it back for our wood. So, and we had a little guy that took us for a guard, and we'd been out with him before, and he used to sit down and chuckle to himself, and he'd say, "You guys fight for the motherland, and I fight for the fatherland." But anyway, you can tell he wasn't a bad little guy. He must have been 60 some odd years old, I'm sure.
Oh, wow.
But he had a big gun. But anyway, one day we were doing the cleaning up, and we came off some mine props. That's pretty good wood for if you could get one.
Yeah.
So we stole a mine prop and put it in the bottom of our wagon below some of the branches and hid it. And be darned, that was the only day that we got inspected. But a forest ranger came along, and they were real Gestapo fellas. And they had, you've seen the pictures of them with the green hat, the tassel, and
Oh, yeah.
and a bicycle with a great big Luger sitting right in the front of the across the handlebars.
Yeah.
And so anyway, he grabbed his Luger up, climbed up in the wagon and looked at the wagon, and he found the mine prop. And he took the 4 of us and he lined us up and told us he was going to shoot us. And here you are staring a gun in the face. And one of the chaps that had gone with us, it was Bernie Spence, a Kiwi airman, and myself, a Canadian airman. And one was an Irish corporal from an Irish regiment. And I'm trying to think who the other was. But anyway, this Irishman, he could speak a little bit of German. And it looked like we were going to be shot in cold blood. So he stepped forward and he said to the guys, forbidden to shoot prisoners of war, that we're not doing anything. And he said, I'm going to turn you into the camp commander for this. And he got the guy flustered. So anyway, he put his Luger away, and we were allowed to come home. And we got away with it, but it's, we all figured that guy, that warden, he seemed like he was off his rocker, glassy-eyed, and it looked like we'd had it, but anyway, nobody got hurt.